Hello friends, I won't take much of your time. I just ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
So there we were, my father, my mother, and me, sitting at the same damn oak dining table we've had since 1985, the one Dad always insisted was real wood, not that IKEA garbage. And everything looked as it should have looked for a traditional American Christmas. Golden ham sweating on a platter, mashed potatoes with too much butter, green beans that had been boiled into submission, and candles flickering on the sideboard like nothing could ever go wrong in this house. I was halfway through chewing a piece of honey-glazed meat when he looked up from his plate. No warning, no preamble, not even a grunt to clear his throat, and said it straight into the silence. "You're a burden, Amanda, and you can't stay with us anymore." That was it. No emotion, just those words, dropped like a concrete block onto the center of the holiday table. I didn't even know what to do with my fork. I just froze, like my own father had slapped me, and I was still deciding whether it had actually happened. Now, I've been through some humiliating moments in my life. Hell, the divorce papers from Travis showed up 3 days after my 40th birthday, and the man didn't even bother to spell my middle name right. But hearing your own father call you a burden while you're eating food you bought with money you earned while your whole world was falling apart, that hits different. And the worst part? My mother didn't say a word, not a whisper, not even a twitch of disapproval in her expression. She just sat there with her napkin folded across her lap like it was any other night, and the air wasn't suddenly full of poison. I don't know what I expected. Maybe a fight, maybe a shouting match like the ones we used to have when I was 17 and wanted to go to college out of state. And he said girls don't need degrees to be wives. But this cold dismissal, it was like he'd been waiting for a perfect moment to cut the cord, and Christmas dinner, with Bing Crosby humming from the radio and the fireplace cracking like a goddamn postcard, was just convenient. I wanted to speak. I wanted to say something that would make him take it back, not because I believed he would, but because I needed to know if there was any love left under all that pride. But instead, I just sat there and chewed that piece of ham like it was cardboard, and let the silence stretch so tight I thought it might split the walls. Maybe I was trying to hold on to my dignity. Maybe I just didn't want to give him the satisfaction of watching me break. The truth is, I hadn't planned on staying forever. I never even planned on coming back. After the divorce, I told myself I'd crash here for a month or two, just until I found something decent. I had some savings, a few freelance gigs, nothing stable, but enough to keep my head above water. I paid for groceries, paid for gas, even fixed their damn leaky roof last spring without telling them the invoice had my name on it. I did it because they were my parents, because I thought after everything, they'd at least give me the grace of time. Instead, I got kicked out like a teenager who broke curfew. And here's the part that really messed me up. I wasn't even surprised. Somewhere deep down, I'd always known my father measured love in usefulness. And the minute he thought I had nothing left to offer, he'd cash me out like an expired coupon. My mother, she was always the quiet one, the peacemaker, the nodder. If he said the sky was green, she'd squint and say it did look a little minty today. But I still held out hope that she'd speak up for me, that maybe, after all these years, she'd put her hand on his arm and say, "Paul, don't be cruel. She's our daughter." But she didn't. She passed me the gravy like we were just having turkey and small talk. I spent the rest of dinner in a fog. I cleaned my plate, thanked my mother for the pie, and even loaded the dishwasher. I didn't say a word about what he'd said, and neither did they. We just pretended, like always. But that night, when I went back to the guest room, which still had Claire's high school trophies on the shelf and my suitcase hidden in the closet like a dirty secret, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the carpet until the sun started creeping through the blinds. And I made a decision. I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't remind them that they hadn't paid their own electric bill since 2019. I'd pack, I'd leave, and I'd let the truth do what I never could. Shut them the hell up. Because if Dad thought I was a burden now, he was about to find out just how much of the house he was actually standing on was mine. And I wasn't going to say it in anger. I was going to say it with facts. Cold, clear, irrefutable facts. I didn't cry that night. I didn't scream into a pillow or call a friend. I just folded my clothes back into my suitcase and put my name back on my own life. Because the next day, I was going to drop a truth bomb that would wipe that smug look off his face for good. And trust me, he'd never forget this Christmas, not after what I was about to say. The morning after Christmas didn't begin with the usual smells of cinnamon rolls or bacon sizzling in the pan, like it used to when I was a kid, when my mom still believed in morning rituals, and my dad hadn't yet perfected the art of quiet bitterness. Instead, it began with an oppressive stillness, the kind that seems to press against your chest before your feet even hit the floor, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see how I'd react to what had been said the night before. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling of the room I used to share with my sister Claire when we were little, and still thought that love in this house was simple. A reward for being good, being useful, being silent. The carpet under my bare feet felt colder than I remembered, and as I walked to the bathroom, I realized no one had spoken a word to me since my father had declared me a burden in the middle of Christmas dinner, like he was announcing the weather or some benign fact about the stuffing. He hadn't said goodnight, and when I passed his door, it was shut tight, not just physically, but emotionally too, like a statement that the door to his approval, to any kind of reconciliation, was no longer available to me. My mother's door was cracked open, and for a brief second, I considered knocking, maybe just to ask if she really thought what he said was fair, if she ever questioned the version of family loyalty she'd signed up for. But I didn't, because I already knew what she'd say. Or rather, what she wouldn't. She'd give me that tight-lipped smile, the one she wears like armor, and say something like, "Your father didn't mean it that way," which of course would mean he absolutely did. So instead of starting a fight I wouldn't win, I went downstairs, poured myself some cold coffee that tasted like it had absorbed the silence in the air, and started packing. Not frantically, not with tears, but methodically, the way you pack when you know this time is final, when you don't expect to come back, and you're not looking for an invitation to stay. Every folded shirt, every zipped-up toiletry bag, felt like a step toward reclaiming something I hadn't even realized I'd lost, until my own father told me I wasn't welcome under the roof I'd been quietly paying for. Because here's what he didn't know, what neither of them knew, that I'd been covering their mortgage for the past 3 years, ever since I discovered they were behind on payments and drowning in late fees while pretending everything was fine. I'd found the overdue notices stuffed behind a pile of magazines when my mom asked me to help sort mail one afternoon, and instead of confronting them, instead of watching my father spiral into one of his shame-fueled rants about how a real man provides, I just called the bank, arranged to take over the payments anonymously, and made sure they never got another red envelope on the doorstep. I did it because I thought that was love, sacrificing your pride so someone else could keep theirs. I did it because I still believed, in some naive corner of my heart, that they'd have done the same for me if the roles were reversed. But yesterday changed that. Yesterday made it crystal clear that in this house, loyalty only flowed one way, up the ladder toward the man at the top, never back down to the daughter who'd held the whole damn structure together when it was crumbling. By noon, my bags were by the door, and I was ready to go. I stood in the living room, the same room where every childhood Christmas photo had been taken, where Claire had opened her first Barbie dream house, and I'd once fallen off the couch trying to hang a stocking. And I waited for someone to say something, to ask where I was going, or maybe just to acknowledge that I existed outside of their disappointment. But no one did. My father was out in the garage, pretending to be busy, probably fiddling with tools he hadn't used in years. My mother was sitting on the edge of her recliner, flipping through a church catalog she wasn't reading, and so I cleared my throat and said calmly, clearly, "Before I go, there's something you should know." My father didn't look up. My mother's hands trembled just slightly, enough for me to notice. I continued, "For the past 3 years, I've been paying your mortgage, and your utilities, and your Medicare supplement plan too. All of it, every month, quietly, because I thought that's what family does, because I didn't want you to lose your home." Silence, not the stunned kind, the defensive, slow-burning kind that makes you want to scream, just to feel something break. My father finally turned his head, his mouth slightly open, as if the words were too big to fit through. "You were—" "What?" he asked, and I swear to God, I saw his face pale like someone had pulled all the blood from it with a syringe. "You were paying for the house?" he said again, softer this time. And for a split second, I thought I saw something human in his eyes. Not love, but fear. And I realized then that he hadn't just been blindsided by my words. He was scared. Because if I stopped, there was no backup plan, no safety net. I looked him in the eye and said, "Yes, I was paying for the house, but I won't anymore." And then I turned to my mother, who looked like she might say something, anything, to stop me. And I said, "You should have spoken up. You knew, and you let him talk to me like I was trash." Still no words, just that same damn silence that had followed me through every room in that house since I was a child. So I picked up my suitcase, opened the door, and stepped out into the cold. And you know what? The air outside was freezing, biting even, but it was honest. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. The motel I checked into that evening was one of those forgettable roadside places just far enough outside of town to feel disconnected from everything familiar, yet close enough that if I leaned against the window and squinted through the parking lot haze, I could almost imagine seeing the glow of my parents' porch light flickering in the distance, still holding on to some false sense of warmth. The room smelled faintly of bleach and disappointment, like someone had tried to scrub out 1,000 stories no one ever wanted to tell, and the bedspread had that tired pattern you see in places where people stay when they have nowhere else to go, but still need to pretend they chose it. I dropped my bags, turned on the lamp, and sat down on the edge of the bed, letting the silence settle in around me like fog, thick and unmoving. I wasn't sad, I wasn't angry, I wasn't anything really. Just empty in the kind of way that doesn't feel like loss, but like a space finally cleared out after years of collecting dust and secrets. There was a television bolted to the wall, one of those flat screens with bad color balance, and I turned it on just for noise. Some sitcom rerun played in the background, characters laughing at problems that were solved in 22 minutes with hugs and credits. And for a moment, I wondered what it would feel like to live in a world that clean. But reality, my reality, had never offered such resolutions. And as I lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling with its faint water stain shaped like a crooked heart, I started to think about how it had all begun. Not the fight, not the dinner, but the decision I made 3 years ago to take on the burden they never asked for, but always expected someone to carry. It was during a visit home, shortly after Travis had left, and I was still figuring out how to be alone without feeling like I'd failed at something. My father had just come back from the hardware store, talking about fixing a leak in the roof, but I noticed he didn't buy anything, just stood in the kitchen reading over a list that never turned into action. Later that night, while my mom dozed off in front of the television, I offered to help sort through the mail piled on the hallway table, an unspoken task no one ever got around to. And that's when I saw it. The past due notice from the bank, printed in bold red letters, threatening foreclosure if payments weren't caught up immediately. At first, I thought it was a mistake. My father, the man who once lectured me for overdrafting my college account by $12, couldn't possibly have missed mortgage payments. But the envelopes kept coming, and soon I realized the situation was worse than I could have imagined. They'd taken out a second mortgage at some point, probably to help Claire with her business classes or to repair the septic tank they never talked about, and the interest was eating them alive. Instead of asking for help, they were ignoring it, pushing the bills into drawers and convincing themselves that pretending everything was fine was the same thing as being fine. I didn't say anything that night. I didn't confront them or wave the letters in their faces, because I knew exactly how that conversation would go. My father would explode, not from shame, but from the indignity of being seen as anything less than in control. And my mother would shrink into herself, apologizing not for the debt, but for my reaction to it. So I took a different route. I called the bank the next morning, set up auto pay from my account, and changed the mailing address so the notices came to my apartment instead. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd cover the payments just until they got back on their feet. But somewhere along the way, it became permanent. Not because they improved, but because they never even knew. I paid for their electricity during the winter blackout that year, and they never questioned why the power stayed on when the rest of the neighborhood went dark. I covered their co-pays when my mother started having trouble with her knees, and my father's blood pressure meds needed a refill. Every dollar I spent was like throwing water into a leaking boat, necessary, exhausting, and never enough. And yet not once did I think of it as a transaction. I thought it was love. I thought it was the kind of silent sacrifice daughters make when no one else is watching. And for a long time, I believed that was noble. But now, sitting in a motel room with a suitcase full of folded dignity and a heart that had finally stopped bleeding for people who would never thank me, I started to feel something else creeping in. Not regret, but a sharp, focused kind of clarity that made me realize how deeply I had been complicit in my own erasure. Because by keeping their secrets, by enabling their pride, I had made it easy for them to forget that I existed beyond my usefulness. I had handed them the power to dismiss me, and they had used it without hesitation. The knock on the motel door came just after midnight. I froze, half expecting it to be a mistake, maybe a drunk guest knocking on the wrong room. But when I looked through the peephole, I saw her, my mother, wrapped in her old wool coat, eyes red, hair still curled the way she always wore it to church. I opened the door without a word, and she stepped inside like someone who hadn't made up her mind whether she was coming to apologize or explain. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. "I knew," she said, not looking at me. "I knew it was you. I didn't tell him because I was afraid of what he'd say, afraid of what it would do to him." I didn't answer right away. I just stared at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the silence I'd endured for so long. "You let him call me a burden," I said, my voice steady. "You let him kick me out while I was keeping the lights on." She sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap like she was praying for forgiveness I wasn't sure I could give. "I thought if I didn't say anything, it would protect you, or him, or both. I don't know anymore." And I realized then that her silence hadn't been passive, it had been chosen. And that made it worse. She looked up at me, eyes glistening, and asked, "Will you come back home?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have one, but because I wanted her to sit with the weight of the question she'd never had the courage to ask before. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't going back. Not now, not ever. There's something strange about the way silence behaves between two people who share a bloodline, but no longer share the ability to tell the truth. It grows heavy, takes up space, stretches between them like a wall that neither is willing to knock on, let alone tear down. That silence sat with us the morning after my mother appeared at my motel door like a ghost who couldn't decide whether to haunt or help me. She hadn't spent the night, of course. She wouldn't dare leave him alone long enough to start questioning her absence. But she stayed just long enough to confess what I already suspected and refused. Until that moment, to admit to myself with any certainty, she had known all along. Not just about the payments, but about everything. The bills, the second mortgage, the health insurance premiums I'd been quietly covering each month like a daughter desperate for a place at the table. She had known, and she had said nothing. Not when he sneered at me from across the dinner table and called me a burden. Not when he told me to pack my things. Not even when I stood at the front door, bags in hand, on the verge of walking away from both of them forever. She said she was afraid of him, of what it would do to him if he found out he'd failed. If he had to face the fact that the daughter he disrespected was the only thing standing between him and foreclosure. But I knew better. She wasn't just afraid of his anger. She was afraid of losing the version of their life she had spent 45 years preserving, like it was the last piece of good china. The one where he was the strong one, the provider, the man of the house. And if she let that crumble, even for a moment, she'd be admitting that the life she'd built around him was a lie. But the thing about lies is that they don't just sit quietly in the corner. They rot, they spread, they poison everything they touch. until even the truth starts to feel like an intrusion. Later that afternoon, after she left the motel, and I was left once again with nothing but my own thoughts and a few leftover fries from a drive-through lunch I barely tasted, my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen on my screen in months. Claire, my younger sister, the golden child who'd flown the nest early and landed soft, a real estate agent in Scottsdale with a Peloton, a wine fridge, and 2 kids. She sometimes let our parents FaceTime if they remembered to call on the right day. We hadn't spoken much since my divorce, mostly because she always found a way to make my problems feel like a personality flaw. Like if I just meditated more or read that one book she kept posting about on Instagram, I'd manifest my way out of every disaster life threw at me. Her message was short and sugary in that way people use when they don't actually want to get involved. Heard about dinner, sorry things got tense, hope you're okay. Let me know if you need to talk. No punctuation, no real warmth, just enough plausible concern to check the box of sisterly obligation. I didn't respond with words. Instead, I scrolled through the files on my phone until I found a photo I'd taken months earlier. A scanned copy of a mortgage statement with my name in the upper right corner under the label, Payer of Record. I sent it with no caption, no explanation, just the truth in black and white. Her reply came 3 minutes later. Wait, what? I didn't answer. Let her sit with that the way I'd sat with my father's words, my mother's silence, the weight of a house built on someone else's labor and pride. But silence, as I've learned, has a strange way of becoming louder the longer you ignore it. And it wasn't long after Claire's stunned response that the voicemail came. Not from her, but from him. 3 words, just 3. We need to talk. No greeting, no apology. Just that clipped tone of command I knew so well, the one he used when I was 15 and had missed curfew, or 25, and dared to disagree with him at Thanksgiving. But something about the way he said it this time felt different. There was no edge, no bite, no certainty, just the thinnest thread of vulnerability wrapped in gravel. I listened to the message 3 times, trying to decide whether I owed him the dignity of a reply. Eventually, I decided I didn't, but I agreed to meet anyway, not for him, not even for my mother, but for myself. Because some wounds only start to heal when you press a finger to them and really feel how deep they go. We met at a diner just off the interstate, the kind with vinyl booths and laminated menus, and a waitress named Donna who's been there so long she remembers your order, even if she forgets your name. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, staring into a cup of coffee that hadn't been touched. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in presence, like someone had deflated the version of him I'd carried around in my head for decades. I sat down without saying anything, just nodded to the waitress and ordered black coffee, even though I didn't want it. When our eyes finally met, I saw something flicker there. Not regret exactly, but a kind of unsettled realization, the beginning of understanding that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't had all the answers. He cleared his throat and said, I didn't know. I know, I said. I didn't ask for that. You didn't have to. You let it happen. He looked down at the table, his fingers tapping against the ceramic mug. I thought I was still the man holding this family together. No, Dad, I said, voice steady, not cruel. You were the man everyone was afraid to disappoint. That's not the same thing. The silence stretched again, thick and uncomfortable, and for once he didn't try to fill it. Maybe because he didn't know how, or maybe because he finally understood that this was his to sit with. When the check came, he reached for it out of habit, but I stopped him. No, I said, this one's on you. He nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the bill, and I stood up, ready to leave, not just the diner, but everything that came before it. And as I walked away, I didn't look back, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. There's a particular kind of satisfaction that comes not from shouting, not from breaking plates or delivering some cinematic monologue, designed to shatter the illusion of power someone holds over you, but from saying exactly what needs to be said in a calm, measured tone, and then walking away, not slamming the door, not weeping in the car, just walking away knowing that everything that needed to be broken already cracked the moment they heard the truth. That's the moment I carried with me as I left the diner and stepped back into the brittle winter air, the kind that makes your skin tighten and your eyes water, not because you're sad, but because the cold itself demands your attention. I didn't cry, not then, not after, not even when I got back to the motel, and sat alone on the edge of the bed with the weight of 30 years' worth of unspoken hurt settling somewhere between my shoulders. I didn't cry, because somewhere between my father's outburst on Christmas and my mother's late-night confession, something inside me had shifted. The girl who once begged for approval, who offered financial lifelines like love letters, hoping to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be enough, she wasn't there anymore. What remained was a woman who had finally stopped performing for an audience that never applauded. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, and thought about the next move, not in terms of revenge, though the word did feel tempting in a satisfying, low-burn sort of way, but in terms of resolution, the kind that doesn't come from reuniting or forgiving, but from cutting the rope and watching the ship drift out to sea. Because forgiveness isn't always the grand finale people pretend it is. Sometimes the real ending is just silence, distance, and peace. The next morning, I stopped by the local branch of the bank where the mortgage was held. I wore jeans and a sweater, hair tied up, no makeup, nothing performative, just me, stripped of all the roles I had played in that house. I asked for a meeting with the branch manager, a middle-aged man with too much product in his hair, and a smile that faltered slightly when I handed him the paperwork I had been holding on to for over a year, documents that proved the house, though still technically in both my parents' names, was under my financial control thanks to a transfer clause buried in the refinancing agreement. When they'd accepted my anonymous assistance, they'd unknowingly signed over controlling interest to the payer. That payer was me. I didn't tell them at the time, not because I was trying to pull a fast one, but because I believed that helping quietly was more honorable. I see now that it was fear. The fear of being resented, of being rejected, of being told, even more directly than I had been on Christmas night, that I was an inconvenience. But now that they had made it clear that my presence was the problem, I had no reason to hold back. I signed the release form that morning, transferring the deed back to them. Every cent still unpaid now, their full responsibility again. The auto payments stopped. The soft protection I had wrapped them in was peeled back. A few hours later, I received another voicemail from my father, and this time he didn't sound cold or furious. He sounded uncertain, like a man who had just realized the floor he'd been standing on for years was not concrete but ice. His words were scattered, fragmented, almost vulnerable. "Amanda, the bank called. We didn't know you had that kind of control." He didn't say sorry. He never said sorry. But I didn't need an apology. What I needed, what I wanted, was for him to sit in the consequence of his choices, to experience, if only briefly, the discomfort he had so easily handed me with his dismissive words. I didn't call back. Instead, I drove 3 towns over to a small apartment I'd put a deposit on just days earlier. A quiet place near the river, where the landlord didn't care about family dynamics or past mistakes, just whether the rent showed up on time. And mine always would. I set up my laptop on the kitchen table, poured myself a glass of red wine, and for the first time in months, I exhaled in a way that didn't feel like I was bracing for someone else's disappointment. Weeks passed, then a letter came. Thick paper, no return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. My mother. Inside was a folded card and a short note that simply read, "I hope you're warm. He's different now." I don't know if that's good or bad, just different. I stared at the words, at the elegant script she'd always used when signing Christmas cards, and wondered if different meant sad, quiet, reflective, or just lonelier now that the help had gone. I placed the note in the drawer and didn't reply. A few days later, I received a package, a legal envelope with a title report from the mortgage company. Attached was a single-page document acknowledging the full assumption of the mortgage debt by the original owners, no longer subsidized, no longer protected, and no longer in my name. At the bottom was a handwritten message from a loan officer I had spoken to once or twice during those first few years. Looks like they're finally standing on their own. Just wanted you to know. Thought you deserved that. I smiled, not out of triumph, but from the quiet satisfaction that comes when the truth finally balances the scale, not by force, but by consequence. I poured myself another glass of wine, stepped out onto my small balcony, and watched the sun slide behind the buildings, casting long shadows over the river below. There are people who believe that justice is loud. A grand confrontation, a shouted revelation, a door slammed in fury. But I've come to learn that the most powerful revenge is silence. It's the absence of support. It's the removal of presence. It's the look on someone's face when they realize the safety net they kicked out from under you was never theirs to begin with. And maybe that's the part that stings the most. Not the loss of me as a daughter, but the realization that I had been the foundation all along. They just never looked down to see what was holding them up.